Hello and welcome to this broadcast brought to you by Reset TV and Extinction Rebellion's Global Participative Democracy Hub. My name's Nessie and we welcome you to this event across our Extinction Rebellion global social media channels. This event is called A Tale of Two Cities, but actually we're really talking about two countries that have run national UK and French citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological emergency. And our two principal presenters will be Claire Mellier, Systems Change and Participation Practitioner, who will present the French case on key design principles, mandate, format and process, overview of the votes, context, what has happened since the votes, political and media context, and then what next? What can we learn from this democratic experiment at this stage? Alex Bradbury, core member of Extinction Rebellion's UK Citizens Assembly Working Group, presents the UK case, Climate Assembly UK, a general update, COVID briefing, and what happens next. We are also joined by other key members involved in either of these citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological justice. Kathy, a core member of Extinction Rebellion Citizens Assembly Working Group UK, and Maxime from Extinction Rebellion France. We will then invite questions from the audience via live stream. We're on XR, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. So please do message your comments and questions during the event, where we will have a team gathering your questions, where some time allowing will be put to the panel on a Q&A. Thanks very much. And we will begin with Alex, who will introduce the first presentation.
Great, thanks Nessie. I don't know if you can see me yet, but could I have the presentation up? I think it's just coming. So I was going to start. So the presentation is probably coming in a second, hopefully. I'm going to start. Here we go. Just to get us all on the same page, really quickly, what a citizens' assembly actually is. So if the next slide, please. So citizens' assemblies, and just keep scrolling through. So what is a citizens' assembly? Well, basically, this is a group of people from all walks of life who come together and learn from experts and affected people about a particular issue. Next. And they influence political decisions. So there are various degrees to which they might influence those decisions, depending on how much power the assembly has been given. So just to take you through the steps of how a citizens' assembly is run, this is kind of like an idealized form. No citizens' assembly is exactly like another, but these are some sort of broad steps. So number one is, if you just click through, Nessie, thanks, randomly select people. So this is why I said people from all walks of life. So you ensure that the assembly is demographically representative of that particular population, whether it's at national level or local level. Number two, you listen to experts and rights holders. So this is this in-depth learning process. So in our case, it would be about climate science and about the policy issues around addressing climate change. Number three, in some cases, you would also get submissions from the public. So ideally, it would be live streamed or even maybe televised and reported on, and the public would be able to engage with the process and make submissions. Number four, and this is really important. This is like the magic, where the magic happens. So facilitated deliberation in groups, and this is where like these kinds of processes really come into their own. So what this means is once you've had all of that learning, then people generally around tables, they will discuss their views on the issues, and essentially these are facilitated by a professional facilitator. Because if you think about from your own life, or if I think about from my life, quite often conversations tend to be dominated by one or two people, maybe because of privileges they have or just their personalities. So these facilitators ensure that everyone's really getting a say. Yeah, and then the next step, number 5, they draft and vote on recommendations on that particular issue. And then number 6, this goes to government or whoever has commissioned the assembly, and they are debated on and implemented. There's a lot more to citizens' assemblies, but hopefully for those that weren't in the picture already, that's given you a rough idea. And we're going to go into 2 really important examples that have been taking place this year, and in the case of the French one last year. So I'm going to talk about, like Nessie was saying, Climate Assembly UK. Next. So Climate Assembly UK. Why was this assembly set up? What were the people asked to do? Well, they were asked to look at ways in which the UK should meet its legally binding emissions target of net zero emissions by 2050. So net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We'll come back to a bit more about that in a minute, because that's the main bugbear we have. It was launched by select committees, 6 select committees. So in the UK, we have a parliamentary system. And it's really a key aspect of it, actually, that this wasn't commissioned by government. It was commissioned essentially by Parliament, or by these parliamentary bodies. I'll come back to that as well a bit later. It's made up of 110 members. So normally citizen assembly is about that number. And in this case, so this random selection was across 7 characteristics. And those were age, gender, ethnicity, education level, whether they live in a rural or urban area, what part of the country they live in, and also, really importantly, their attitude to climate change. So this was based on Ipsos Mori survey, which basically asked people's level, or assessed people's level of concern with climate change. And so the people in the room, they reflected the general population in terms of the numbers of people who were more or less concerned. And so it was initially, well, mostly held in Birmingham in the Midlands in the UK, in England. It was initially planned for 4 weekends. The first 3 weekends happened before the second. The 4th one went online, and then was sort of broken up into 3 different pieces. Sorry, I'm just checking that I'm covering everything. Don't want to miss anything. Yeah, so still on that, just to give you an idea of how they kind of structured the assembly on the second weekend. So the first one, you had a kind of plenary, so all 110 people together, learning about climate science and some of the general issues. And then on the second weekend, they split into 3 groups, and they covered how we travel, it was called, in the home, and then what we buy, land use, food and farming. So they covered the sort of different sectors separately. And those groups, again, were once again like stratified. So that means that they were made sort of representative of the population in those separate groups. And in terms of, sorry, you can see the next few bullets on this second to last bullet. So in terms of what comes out of it, so like I said before, you have a report that comes out, and that's going to come out in September, and that will contain people's preferences around certain, there'll be a whole host of issues, you know, when we phase out electric vehicles and all of these kinds of things, and the level of agreement with particular statements. And like I said, that's due in September. And a couple of weeks ago, they also produced an interim briefing to do with COVID, and Kathy's going to talk about that more in a second. It was funded by the House of Commons, and there were 4 expert leads who were chosen by Parliament, and they had various roles, one of which was to choose the speakers at the assembly. So you need to have a range of speakers who will, these experts that present on the issue. And they kind of, in Climate Assembly UK, they distinguished between informants, who are people that had to present, they were tasked with presenting a kind of like consensus view, so not their own view. And when they did bring their own view in, they had to say, this is just my opinion. And then they also had what were called advocates, who explicitly were understood to be presenting a subjective view. And when you had those advocates, you would generally have someone from one end of the spectrum and someone from the other end of the spectrum, whatever the issue might have been. So you had people like, for instance, Greenpeace presenting, but you also had Rolls-Royce presenting. And then there were these advisory panels who added a kind of a check and balance. So they also, you had like 20 people on the advisory panel, and they were from all different kind of political and activist groups across the spectrum. And then finally, it's actually pretty complicated, all of these different bodies, but you finally had a charity called Involve, who did the kind of process. You had the expert leads who were leading on the content, and then you had Involve who were generally leading on the process of the assembly and the logistics and that kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, next slide, keep clicking. How was it? How was Climate Assembly UK? Well, we don't know what's in the report, but we do know about how it was run. Obviously, I've touched on the parameters around it. So we think, or I think, it was a step in the right direction. I was actually there. I observed a couple of the sessions on the first couple of weekends, and I really was super excited to be there, to be frank, and to see, all of these different kinds of people really getting their teeth into something I am really concerned about, and a lot of people are really concerned about, and then going home and doing my homework and asking super interesting questions. And it was just really exciting to see this form of democracy come to life, and really kind of the humanity of the way in which people interacted with each other, and really formed this sort of expertise and reflection over what we're used to seeing, which is sort of political expedience and kind of these debates in the House of Commons. It was nice to see this happening in a different way. Yeah, and also I was really impressed by like the kind of nuanced sort of meta discussion around the role that people had in the room. So people, they were given a presentation on critical thinking, for instance, or also asked to think about the resistances that they might feel and question them when sort of thinking about the more technical issues. So I thought that was really good as well. That the kind of like almost emotional side, or there was also brought into it, or at least maybe not the emotional, but at least the psychological aspect. But really, the report will be, sorry if you could click through a couple, Nessie, thanks. The next one as well, Nessie. And so the report will be key in terms of like what's actually come out of it. So that kind of remains the big question mark. And so having said all that, the parameters around the assembly. So while it's great this has happened, this is the biggest citizens assembly we've seen in the UK so far, and it was broadly well run. There are some really key criticisms around like how the task it was given. So this 2050 target is obviously way too late. We can't take 30 years to address an emergency. And also getting to net zero by 2050 is based around a global target. So it doesn't take into account our responsibility in the UK to go faster because we're fifth highest in terms of our historical emissions. We have a capacity to get to net zero faster. And it also doesn't take into account consumption emissions. So it's only emissions produced on UK soil. So anything from imported goods, say goods produced in somewhere like China, that we're responsible for, weren't addressed at this assembly. Now, interestingly, just one point on that is that these topics, I say they weren't addressed, they were actually brought up, but the remit of the assembly was to only look at the government target on its own terms. So they didn't have the power to actually do anything about these other really super important aspects. Next one. So there's also a narrow focus. While emissions is super important, there's also other aspects which weren't addressed at the Assembly. Again, this could be something that could be looked at a bigger Assembly. And really, in saying all of these criticisms, I think it's important to note that we don't want, I don't want to kind of like poo-poo this Assembly and what it can achieve. It's just, I think we need to call for something else as well. So yeah, the narrow focus is, yeah, not just emissions. It didn't cover biodiversity. We didn't look at adaptation. Next one, Nessie. Yeah, and then also, like I was saying, no government buy-in. So while it's great that the select committees chose to embrace this form of deliberative democracy, it really should be the government that's doing it. And the select committees, their role is to scrutinise the work of government. So they're at one remove, a really important remove. They're not responsible for policy making. So when the recommendations go to the select committees, they'll consider them, and then eventually they might be debated in Parliament. But there are some hurdles before we really see any action taken on any recommendations. Next, Nessie. Okay, over to Kathy.
Right, hi, I'm just going to unmute. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background here. In early April, the French Assembly participants, of their own accord, they wanted to make a public response to the COVID-19 crisis. And they actually presented 50 of their draft proposals, which they obviously felt were relevant and had a positive effect on the climate, on economic activity, and quite importantly, they considered it in a spirit of social justice, as well as on health and well-being of the population. So it seems that rather following this example, but at the request of both Parliament and the Assembly members themselves, at the final weekend of the Climate Assembly UK included a brief opportunity, it was pretty brief, for Assembly members to discuss the changed context for reaching net zero as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, to let Parliament know what they were thinking. The Assembly's thoughts on this process, on this topic, carry a certain weight insofar as that there's no other group that is both a representative sample of the UK population and reasonably informed with sorts of measures that are needed to reach net zero. So they received a 15-minute presentation from one of the expert leads. He did start out saying that there are no direct links between the virus and climate change, but that the life changes that have resulted are linked to what the Assembly has been discussing. Well, yes and well, no, because yes, it's definitely too early in the day to come up with fully backed up supporting evidence, but it is likely that there is a connection between because most things don't exist in splendid isolation. The connection hasn't been clearly made yet. So the other thing, if we're consuming things produced elsewhere here, now, these overseas emissions should rightly be counted as our emissions. So in fact, I forgot to mention something that he said. He also suggested, that there might be public pressure to make more things here that we consume in the UK so that we're not exposed to the risks of interruptions to importing goods in the future. And he said that could mean higher emissions here in the UK if we produce these things using fossil fuels here in the UK. Well, if we are consuming things produced elsewhere, here, now, these overseas emissions should rightly be counted as our emissions. So in actual fact, our emissions shouldn't be higher. One of the shortcomings of this Assembly, as Alex has pointed out, is it hasn't concerned itself with overseas emissions. He mentioned taxes. Should they go up? Should they be cut? There was no reference to poverty and social justice at any point that I have seen in the presentation or the report. Anyway, so the Assembly has published this briefing ahead of its final report due in September. I'm still quite trying to find out why we don't get the results until September. The French managed to get their recommendations out in the public domain about 3 days after the end of the Assembly. Seems like it's going to be more like 3 months here, but that's something interesting. The citizen representatives agreed to 2 official Assembly recommendations, one on economic recovery and one on lifestyle changes. And they also commented on their reasons for agreeing or disagreeing. So for economic recovery, Assembly members discussed whether they felt that the steps taken by the government to help the economy recover should be designed to help achieve net zero. And in total, as you can see there, 79% of the members strongly agreed or agreed with this. It's not really a surprising result, since the government, although ignoring it, is tied by law to net zero, and the Assembly itself is seeking to find the path to achieve this. If you look at some of the comments that the citizen representatives made that are actually in the report itself, there were a lot of comments from the citizens. Many of them were positive. Those who were unsure or who disagreed intended to emphasize the need to focus on economic recovery first and foremost, the need to get the economy back on its feet and running before tackling climate, suggesting that a connection between economy and climate hasn't been made quite yet. Lifestyle changes. The Assembly members also discussed whether they felt that this was the second recommendation they made, discussed whether they felt that the government, employers and others should take steps as lockdown eases to encourage lifestyles to change to be more compatible with reaching net zero. And here we had 93% of the Assembly members strongly agreed or agreed that such steps should be taken. Well, in a way, it's understandable that there was a high percentage of support for this, because lifestyle is much more familiar territory to people than economics. And economics is something slightly out there and to be slightly afraid of. Anyway, so as a result of the actual experience of lockdown, there were comments encouraging the continuation of home working, encouraging changes how we travel, and taking the opportunity to change, that we're at a pivotal point. They recognise that there's a pivotal point from which change can be built on. Again, none of the comments suggest that social justice was part of the considerations. It may well have been, but I haven't seen any overt evidence of that. But there was a recognition from the citizen representatives that government has a role to play, and that it needs to be beyond us just all doing our bit. And a recognition of the importance of information. The coronavirus crisis has shown that the public will respond to changes if they have sound, clear, and trustworthy information. That isn't always the case. There was a recognition from citizen representatives that government has a role to, oh, sorry, I've done that. Right, so in terms of information, in XR speak, that really is tell the truth. So whether it is coronavirus or the climate and ecological emergency, there seems to be a tendency to look to treat the symptoms rather than examining the underlying causes, which need addressing to bring about the systemic change that we need to see. So we're going to go on now to what next? Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So last slide, and it's a quick one from us. What next? I really mean by this, we've talked about the reports coming out in September, and what next from our point of view, or people interested in this process. I think it's really important to help build the conversation. And if you just add, do the next two as well, Nessie, help build the conversation and really generate momentum for the report. And I think the more we can push this into the public eye, the easier it's going to be for us to have a kind of some level of nuance around our approach to it as Extinction Rebellion. Because, like I say, we're sort of at pains to point out that this isn't our third demand met, and yet there are likely to be recommendations which are steps in the right direction. And it's hard for us to kind of have a sort of to present that opinion, that kind of like spectrum of opinions, if people aren't really talking about it. Then it's gonna, do you know what I mean? Like, we're gonna have to have a sort of soundbite. Do we like it? Yes, no. So I think it's really important to just like post about it on social media and get people talking about this. And then also we can really build on Climate Assembly UK and point to the pros and cons of it in calling for a citizens' assembly which meets the third demand. Yeah, that's all we wanted to do from our point of view, and I think it's over to Claire next.
Thanks so much for that, both of you, Kathy and Alex. Yes, now over to Claire. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nessie. Hi, good to see you, everyone, virtually. I don't know where you are, but nice to connect. So I'm Claire Mellier. I'm an observer, researcher of the French Convention Citoyenne. And I have been observing the Convention from the start. And I'll tell you a bit about the process and the outcomes, what's come out of the last, the weekend, the votes, basically. So I'll start sharing my screen. Here we are. So this was at the Élysée Palace, where the citizens met Emmanuel Macron. That was on 29th of June, and it was basically the day Emmanuel Macron responded to the citizens to tell them what his thoughts were on the Convention's recommendations. So I'll tell you a bit about the process, the mandates, and also what was basically the question that was asked to the citizens. So back in 2019, if you remember, in France, we had the Gilets jaunes protest, which was as a result of the rise of the carbon tax, and that created major social tensions. The rise of the eco tax was banned, the carbon tax was banned, and there's a group called the Gilets Citoyenne, which came together, which is basically a kind of umbrella organization which brings together the Gilets jaunes representative, deliberative democracy experts, green activists, all together under this group called Gilets Citoyens. And they came to Macron and said they would like a citizens' assembly to be run on the climate crisis. And following lots of discussions and lots of exchanges and trying to understand what was possible, Emmanuel Macron decided to launch the Convention. That was back in April. It was announced in April 2019. And his commitment was to not filter anything that would come out of the Convention. The question that was put forward to the Assembly members was how to reduce greenhouse gas emission in France by at least 40% in relation to 1990s level by 2030 in the spirit of social justice. And I've highlighted there the at least and social justice because there are two critical points actually in the way the question was framed. I'll come back to that a bit later. The aim was to come up with mesures structurantes, which is, you could say, structural recommendations or transformative recommendation that will be enacted either through referendum, parliamentary vote, or directly turn into regulation. There were 150 citizens selected by sortition, so with a stratified sampling, very similar to what Alex described for the UK Assembly. There were only 6 criteria in the case of France because there were no ethnicity criteria, which is illegal in France. The process, there were 7 face-to-face sessions and 2 online weekends as a result of COVID. And on top of that, there were ongoing themed webinars throughout the process. The budget was 5 million euros. And finally, just a little bit about the way the process was run. There was a governance committee, which you could say was a body which basically made the decisions about how the process was run. So it was a bit different from the UK Assembly in the sense that these 15 people on the governance committee plus 2 citizens rotating between each session, being part of this governance committee, were making decisions. And then the delivery organizations, so the facilitators, then were running the process. I'll move to the next slide. I hope it's not too fast. So in terms of what are the original features of the Convention, and we don't have many other processes we can compare with which are on the climate crisis. The other one I'm aware of was the Irish Climate Assembly, but it was a bit different. So in terms of this, the Convention, it's highly political, you could say, due to the way it was born, so the context, the origin, and also the way it's been, the governance committee works. You know, we had Laurence Tubiana, who is the key Paris Agreement architect, as the co-chair of the Convention. And then within the governance committee, you had green activists and private sector bodies, and so the decisions are highly have been political. Second aspect that's really interesting is what they've called the logistic transcription. Don't know if that makes sense in English, but the comité légistique, basically the measures have been translated into legal text with supports from public law experts. So that's, and I think this was one of the key requirements from Emmanuel Macron at the start, and the pressure was really put on very clearly throughout the process to make sure that whatever came out of the Convention was fit for direct translation into referendum or legislation, or direct transcription into regulation. So that's why the emphasis was on making these measures law abiding. And there was a group of public law experts who supported the citizens throughout the process to do that. And I'll come back to that maybe if there are any questions about that later. The other feature is the fact that it's a kind of consensus approach. The process was really geared towards bringing people together and moving towards consensus as much as possible. And that's partly why all the votes happen only at the end, in session 7, at the very end. There were no votes happening at any other point, which is quite different from the way other assemblies have been run. Media strategy was very open, so the media were very welcome and actually invited right from the start. And it took a little while to get media interest, but it did work in the end because the conversations was brought beyond the walls of the assembly, you could say. So because of the media involvement, it has pros and cons, and we've seen that, yeah, it's been a bit of a blessing and a curse, to be honest, because sometimes, obviously, as we know, the media can focus on some aspects rather than others. And so, especially at the time when the votes happened and the recommendation, there was a bit too much emphasis probably on some of the most controversial measures and not the rest. And just related to that, there was a choice given to citizens about their anonymity, whether they wanted to, be interviewed, and a lot of them decided to actually not remain anonymous, and that was their choice. And they were supported to do that. Myself and a group of researchers of about 30 people were invited to observe the process right from the start. So we had to submit our request, and then we were invited to observe, and that was really interesting because that's actually quite unusual, I think, that a multidisciplinary group of researchers have been invited to observe absolutely everything. So we've from the small conversations to all the the plenary discussions. So that was at some occasions we were banned from witnessing some exchanges, but pretty much I have to say I think that's a really interesting process, and we can learn a lot from that. And the researchers actually are working at the moment on putting an article that would summarize at this stage what our key learning. Each research group will have different take, and then over the next few years we'll have lots of insights coming from that. In terms of facilitation, Alex was mentioning in his presentation that the assumption for citizens' assemblies, you would have table facilitation. Well, there was a choice for the Convention to not actually have table facilitation. So there were two, what I would call moderators for each group of 30 citizens. So there were 5 themes, and I can talk about that a bit later. But it was quite an interesting take. And as a facilitator myself, initially I was quite concerned about the lack of facilitation. And again, I can see pros and cons, and I can come back to that. And finally, I think we've really witnessed collective intelligence, and that's a word that has come back again and again, both from the citizens themselves and the observers, saying that what's happening is that we've seen a real bottom-up process where the 149 measures have come up from the citizens, highly supported by experts, and some will say, some of the observers have, we've witnessed sometimes a bit too much influence, maybe. But to be fair, it has come up from the citizens. I'll go next. So in total, there were 149 measures. There were initially 150, and that was actually pure coincidence that there were that number, and which was matching the number of citizens, but that has nothing to do with the number of citizens. It's a pure coincidence. The final report that was voted on was 460 pages in total, which shows how much work has gone into this. And you can find a translation of all the measures on the link that I've provided. And also, so in terms of the votes, the votes were done by block of objectives rather than individual measures, which was actually a bone of contention, and that came up on the final weekend where the votes happened, which is for me quite fascinating to see that this came up as a contentious aspect and hadn't been discussed in advance with citizens. They seemed quite surprised, and in the end, everyone was fine with that. But I think there's something that we'll need to reflect on. The 5 themes that I was talking about that citizens looked at were consumption, consommer, travel, se déplacer in French, production and work, produire et travailler, food, which was se nourrir, and housing, se loger. And there were also votes on the revision of the constitution. So what's interesting is that the way the process was designed initially was to go look at climate change through the lens of these 5 themes. But the citizens brought up a lot of questions that they felt were kind of overarching, such as the constitution and what could be changed to add, climate change within the constitution and things like that, and the financing of all these measures. And so initially, at the start of the process, a group called List Squad was created, which looked at all these overarching themes. And again, that created quite a lot of tension. In the end, that group was stopped because it felt like some people had more influence than others, because these were quite critical topics. So that revealed quite a lot of interesting aspects around power dynamics and who is part of this group or not. And what was fascinating is to see that only one measure was rejected during the votes in June, on the 20th, 21st of June, out of 149. And it was the 28 hours working week, which was rejected by 65%. And that triggered a lot of very interesting debate on that day. All the other objectives gained support, and the average was between 80 and 99%, which shows the level of consensus that these measures have achieved. And there was one measure that didn't have quite that level of support. That was the speed reduction on the motorway, which was the vision was to reduce it from 130 to 110. And that only got 60%. And that's the measure that the media have really focused on, and that has created a lot of debate in France. And then there were votes in favor of the referendum. I'm just checking time. The revision of the preamble got 76% support, and revision of Article 1, 85% support, 55% support. And these are basically suggestions to introduce climate change and the protection of biodiversity in the Constitution. And finally, the third vote that gained the support from the citizens to go out for referendum was the introduction of the law of ecocide in French criminal law, and that got 63% support. So that measure about the ecocide received actually 99% support, but putting that for referendum got 63%. What we noticed, which was fascinating, is to witness that the citizens suddenly that weekend expressed how fearful they were actually to put their measures out for referendum. And the main arguments they were expressing was that, they had been on this journey for the last 9 months where they've learned so much, and they felt that they were more informed, and they were worried that the rest of the French population was not, and would be rejecting some of their measures. What was really interesting is to see that after the votes, several polling companies have actually checked how the French population stand on some of these measures. And what's fascinating is that actually there's a high level of support for the measures that have emerged. And one of a really interesting poll shows that, I'm trying to find the stats, but maybe I'll come back to that in the Q&A if there are more. But anyway, that's interesting. Next, so what's happened since the votes? So the citizens have decided to come together and create this association. So it's like a charity status for the 150 citizens to join if they want to ensure then that whatever has come out of the Convention is followed through, or if not, then they decided to basically create this NGO to monitor and push basically for their measures to be taken forward. And as far as I know, there are about 130 people who have joined out of 150. There might be more now, but when I asked a couple of weeks ago, that was the number. There's a platform which has been created. So as a result of the Convention, there's been a lot of parallel kind of movements or groups which have emerged to support what the Convention has been doing. And one of them is an interesting initiative, I think, which is called Voter pour le Climat. It's a consultation platform which has basically put all the measures from the Convention available for anyone in France. You have to be a resident to be able to vote and give your opinion on these on the measures. And as far as I know, I think people can vote until the 13th or 14th of July. Yeah, 14th of July, and they have received almost 1 million votes and 20,000 people registered. They were aiming for 100,000 people, but 1 million votes have been registered. So it shows the level of interest. And as I said before, we've had polls to assess the level of support, and pretty much they've all been in favor of the measures, apart from the speed reduction on motorways and things like that. So if you remember the picture I shared at the very start, that was citizens at the Élysée Palace. So they've been lucky to be invited. So it's interesting because Emmanuel Macron really wanted to respond back. He came, it was at session 4, he came to see them at the Conseil économique, social et environnemental where the convention was taking place. So he had already one opportunity to meet the citizens and do a question and answer session and express his vision. And this was basically his opportunity on the 29th to say, this is what I'm taking away from your recommendations. And he took what he called the jokers, so 3 jokers basically. He said he wanted to, he was supportive of 146 measures, but there were 3 of them that he didn't support, and he said, he explained why. One was the 4% tax on dividends for companies with 10 million euros, I think it's profit, or can't remember exactly, I should check if you want. But anyway, that was regarding companies and tax on dividends. He was not in favor of going ahead with the 110 kilometers speed limit on motorways. And finally, the modification of the preamble of the Constitution. He said he was in favor of a referendum on changing Article 1 of the Constitution, which would be framed as, which would include the sentence to guarantee the preservation of biodiversity and fight against climate change. And with regards to the ecocide, which has been probably the most widely covered in the Anglo-Saxon press, it's been interesting because actually he hasn't committed to putting this up for referendum. What he said is that he will ensure this term, ecocide, is enshrined in international law so that leaders are accountable before the International Criminal Court. So he's taking a stand on the international scene in a way, but within France, he's saying, I'm going to work with experts and you yourself, this 150 citizens, to explore this. How could this be implemented in French legislation? But he's not committing to any more than that, actually. It's quite easy to go on the international stage and say, from his perspective, it's probably easier to go on the international stage rather than committing to it at the level of the country. what he said, he's open to holding a referendum in 2021 on one or several of the Convention's measures. So it will be interesting. Let's remember that the presidential election will happen in 2022. And so it's in that context, everything is highly political. And I don't think we should fool ourselves, but these assemblies are political. And I think it became really obvious with the Convention. It's not just about informing public policy making. It's very much, in the case of the French Convention, set in a highly political context, and that has, impacted everything really. So what next? Well, there's so much we're learning, and we're going to learn probably for a while, because, as I said, a lot of the researchers who I've been observing won't release any of their findings for a while. What I'm personally interested is how there are probably 6 really critical aspects that I think we need to explore, and that would be good to see what people think during the Q&As. But at the moment, there's a focus on climate carbon mitigation, and adaptation is never mentioned, or very superficially. And I think that's probably a risk going forward, because it's not allowing people to actually really connect with the reality of climate change now. And by just focusing on mitigation, there's this kind of artificial perspective, which is all about the future rather than the past and the present. And I think, for me, mitigation and adaptation are really 2 sides of the same coin. And just to give you a practical example, when we're talking about climate mitigation and or flood risk, people, for instance, will think about flood risk in terms of building a new flood defense, and if that has impacts in terms of the need for cutting trees down, or people won't be able to see how everything fits together unless we allow them to see that things are linked. And what's interesting is that Chris Stark, who is the chief exec of the Climate Change Committee, and the Climate Change Committee in the UK, has released, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, a report on how the UK government is doing in terms of its targets. And what Chris Stark said is that he's really he's recommending a citizens' assembly on adaptation, which is interesting. But for me, in a way, they should be looked at in parallel, not separately. But that's up for discussion. I'd love to know what people think. The other aspect is transformative versus incremental change. So people, in these assemblies, people keep talking about the need for radical change, but actually we've got no definition of what transformative change is, and what some people think as transformative is for other people actually incremental change. And we're still thinking, in my opinion, in silos. And so I get it that people, are saying we need to look at climate change from the perspective of the citizens and take things at the level of the citizens. And that's probably why it's been structured in, looking at consumption, travel, food, so what feels familiar to citizens. But actually, I do think that we need to maybe completely reassess the way we look at this, and system thinkers and system change practitioners are going to have to do a lot of work on that in the next few years, looking at making it easy for people to understand what system change is. And what I'd really like to explore in the future is how do we look at climate change from perspective of where are the key levers and the key barriers to change, and how can we make the most radical change within the time frame we've got. And that's where experts' input would be, in my opinion, the most critical. So when Alex was talking about the 2050 targets, there might be a question that we need to have right at the start of these processes, which is getting experts to say, well, this is why I think 2050 is the right target. And then the other experts saying, no, that's not. And at the moment, I think the voices of the experts hasn't been given the same weight. A lot of the climate scientists who have been more, how to say it, who have been critical of the 2050 targets haven't been given the space potentially to express why. So I think that's something that will be interesting to see in the future if that changes. A few more minutes and then I'll try to wrap up. The other aspect that's interesting is bottom-up versus top-down processes. So I would say that some of these assemblies are seen more as extractive in a way. So they're informing citizens, they're going through a deliberation, and then you're extracting data from them. So it's a way of assessing, how citizens, a representative sample of the population, how they see policy options, for instance. That's one way of looking at these assemblies. The other way, which was more the case for the French process, which was more bottom-up, so where this idea of collective intelligence is quite strong. So citizens are actually encouraged to come up with their own, ideas and can influence the process more. So that's another big difference, I think. And then this idea of deep versus wide engagement. So the French Convention has been really open to the outside world and really interested in actually bringing the conversations beyond the assembly members. And on the other side, you could say that it has put risks, it has had implications. And in the case, the most obvious case for me was when some of the measures that was communicated, which was that was during the COVID, basically recommendations from the French Assembly, they were leaked by some of the French media, and as a result, they went out to the wider public. They were supposed to be just communicated to Emmanuel Macron, but in the end, everyone heard about it. So there's a risk, if you open a process, well, you have to be prepared that things like that will happen. But I think you have to weigh the pros and cons. I would say at this stage, my instinct is that the benefits outweigh the risks. Another key aspect will be whether it's citizens-led versus commissioning body-led. And that's what I mean by that is that it's all about power and leverage points. And I think Emmanuel Macron, in a way, in the French process, despite not being at all involved in the running of it, or obviously it's been set up in a way that it was independent from him, but it's been obvious that he had actually quite a lot of power on how the process was evolved. And especially I remember when he came to see the citizens, it was, when was that? Back in session 4. As a result of that, you could see that there was such a strong emphasis on making these measures fit for purpose to be directly translated into legislation or not, because he really made that clear during his speech with the citizens. And you could see as a result of that, then the focus was really strong on making these measures fit for purpose. And that's where the Comité Légistique really had actually quite a strong role in the process. And final points, opinion versus values and beliefs versus governing sentiments. What I mean by that is that at the moment, a lot of these assemblies are really engaging people's brain. So it's all about experts' input, and it's very rational. And you could say maybe there's a tradition of, it's the enlightenments and how these processes are designed are very serious. And of course they go to the level, so you could say that the political debates and what we're noticing in a very polarized world is pretty much always at the level of the opinions. These assemblies are good for going at the level of values and beliefs, so you go a level deeper, but still I think what's missing is that you need to go at the level of what I call governing sentiments, so heartfelt connections where you really get people's ability to empathize a lot more, and that's going to be, I think, the challenge, especially when we look at a global scale and stop looking at climate change from the perspective of our own world as, you know, global north and westernized, you know, countries. It's about opening up to the reality, not just of climate change in the future, but actually climate change now, which goes back to my original point about adaptation, actually. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you. Thank you all for such fascinating presentations. And these have generated a range of questions from the XR global social media channels. Clearly the scope, remit and political clout of the CAs in France and the UK are significantly divergent. So it'll be really interesting to see what the panel has to reply to some of the questions. I have one from Fritzi from Facebook questioning, was Extinction Rebellion ever mentioned at the event? So shall we begin if Alex has any idea about that?
I didn't hear Extinction Rebellion mentioned in the presentations, maybe obliquely. Yeah, I know that in some of the report, I mean, well, in the reporting, especially right at the beginning when it was announced, it was somewhat problematically reported as, you know, the government responds to Extinction Rebellion's demand. Well, A, it wasn't the government, and B, it's not meeting the third demand. And yeah, and I do remember reading it in some of the reports around, like, the assembly members themselves talking about, you know, well, to be honest, there was one comment where somebody said, "This is where the action really happens. You know, we've had enough of the protests now. Let's you know, now we need these kinds of, like, in-depth processes." And obviously, as a member of XR, you're like, oh, but actually, I was like, this is exactly what we want. Like, it's not about XR. Brilliant. Like, yeah, great. Okay, somebody is, like, disassociating citizens' assemblies from Extinction Rebellion, and yeah, and it's becoming a broader conversation. So I thought that was great. But yeah, to be honest, I don't think it was mentioned at the assembly itself. And I think there was probably, my suspicion would be, there's an attempt to kind of, and quite understandably, an attempt to sort of, like, not see the Citizens' Assembly as Climate Assembly UK as somehow, you know, too associated with us, because then it's going to be difficult sort of for MPs to engage with it. So yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, Kathy, at all? Claire or Maxime, are you aware of any reference to Extinction Rebellion during the French Convention?
Shall I go and then Maxime?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Well, it was mentioned, yeah, a lot, actually, right from the start, and it's public, so you can go back to have a look. But one of the citizens mentioned Extinction Rebellion weekend one, and then it's been mentioned quite a fair bit, yeah, in the conversations. Yeah, it did come up. Definitely, and you saw people wearing XR badges during the convention. Yeah.
And
maybe I should just say, sorry, as a caveat, a lot less of the CA UK was public, as far as I understand, than the French one. So it could have come up all the time at the tables. We don't know.
Do either of you got opinions on whether movements such as Extinction Rebellion should be a stakeholder?
Maxime, do you want to go?
What do you mean by stakeholder exactly? Like, which role?
a stakeholder representing the stake in the assembly's debates, deliberation, as a holding a position on the climate and ecological emergency.
I mean, I think. Sorry, go on, someone else.
Oh, sorry.
Maxime?
Yeah, just on that. Yeah, I was just wanted to say, we've got Extinction Rebellion in France were supporting the citizens from the convention a lot. So basically, we were protesting in front of the building where the convention were happening during the different physical session to encourage the citizen to be more radical into their proposition. So it was a way to do the link between the civil society Extinction Rebellion protesters were representing and the citizen from the convention as well. And we have a short discussion with them at the end of every session to tell them to be more radical and all this stuff. So Extinction Rebellion were kind of present outside of the building, but not inside. And some of the, like Claire said, some of the citizens from the convention, they had some badges and some XR logos on their vest or on their t-shirt and stuff like that. So it was a bit like surprising at some point when how radical they became and how they are XR compatible they became when they heard about the movement actually. So this is actually the way we try to interact with them actually.
Thanks, Maxime. Thank you. I have another question.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, maybe add on to that, because I think your question was about how XR could be a stakeholder. And I think there are different ways of looking at this. And you could say that, and I know it's the case in some of the citizens' assembly that have been designed and citizens' juries in the UK where XR was part of the steering group, for instance. So they've been consulted as part of the design process. That was the case for Leeds, I think, and it's the case at the moment with the citizens' juries that is happening in Kendal. So that's one way they could play a role, but you could say that XR could also be a stakeholder presenting perspective, like as Alex mentioned, you know, in the differentiation between informant and advocate. So you could say that XR could be an advocate in these processes. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to just add.
Thanks, Claire.
Can I just say something quickly on that?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an important. I agree with what Claire said as well, and that there are different ways to engage with it. I think we were really conscious that the whole point of our third demand is that we are placing action on a more democratic basis. So I think it's important for us to be involved as one voice among others, but what comes out of the assembly can't be seen to be overly influenced by XR, because it needs to be seen as the view of a demographically representative section of the population. So yeah, but you can still, that doesn't mean you can't engage, but it's important that it's not seen as XR Citizens Assembly.
Yeah, very important point. Thank you, Alex. So I have a question from Justin. I'll direct it to you, Claire, please. At the UKCA, was there a more challenging view of the science, e.g. Professor Kevin Anderson, or just conventional scientist view that fits with the 2050 agenda? Actually, that would be more to Kathy then and Alex. But also, if Claire, if you can also comment on that, please, from your perspective.
I'm not that familiar with all the people who presented, but I don't think that there was a overtly radical thinking. I think it was, you know, that the presentations were pretty much within, I think Greenpeace, somebody presented from Greenpeace, but I think, you know, that in the French Convention, the citizens were able to ask for other people to present, whereas in the Climate Assembly UK, it was all very tightly controlled by the organisers, and the citizens didn't have that opportunity. So yeah, I think it was much more, I mean, they were quite different. On the other hand, I think the French Convention had quite a lot of political from the top, and in part of the advisory group, there was a lot more political input than I think was at the Climate Assembly UK. Not 100% sure.
Thanks, Kathy. Alex, do you have anything to add?
I agree with Kathy. I think that it sort of towed the line in terms of the 2050 target largely, because that was very much a remit that was respected as far as what was made public anyway so far. There were definitely questions from the Assembly members about whether we should be going faster than 2050. And some of the presenters did mention things like, for instance, that we started the Industrial Revolution, our historical responsibility, or for instance, that other countries have a kind of right to development, so more of a right to produce emissions, and we should be cutting faster, all of these different aspects. Or for instance, the difference between production and consumption emissions was explained, but it wasn't left open. The remit was still kept the same, which is different to the French one. There was no flexibility in terms of, oh, by the way, you can kind of you can sort of blow this up if you want to, Assembly members, and talk about something else. There was an option to talk to use a session on the final weekend, which was ended up being going online for the Assembly members to kind of set the agenda themselves. But then the pandemic hit, so that became the focus of that.
So you feel that the framing of the question was a constraining factor?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think another thing which maybe I forgot to say in the presentation was that it was also it was obviously a lot shorter than the French one, and it was, I think, a tenth of the budget. It was £500,000, so £500,000. Maybe that's not a tenth, but anyway, a lot less. And so it didn't really have the scope or the ambition to really address this. That's why I'm saying it's a very small kind of stepping stone on the way. But yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Claire, would you like to comment? Also, there's another part of the question that said, was there an examination of the cause of the climate crisis, or just a sifting through of policy options without examining what the driver, e.g. economic systems focused on growth?
So in the French, in the Convention, they were, during weekend one, they definitely went into the drivers. And interestingly, I think that came up from the citizens a lot, that, these points around, is GDP the right metrics for assessing, how we produce and how we live, and so big questions actually came from the citizens. And but because in the same case as for the Climate Assembly, the frame is actually net zero 2050. So the question is different in France, because they looked at reduction by 40% by 2030, but actually both countries, the UK and France, have a net zero 50 target. Net zero 2050 target. The point I wanted to make before I forget is that in the case of the Convention, the citizens themselves were able to ask for experts to be brought in. So that was quite a good opportunity for them to suggest people who were more radical potentially. It's for, I've discussed it with some of the observers and researchers, and maybe it didn't actually allow a lot of the more interesting perspectives to be brought in, but at least there was an intent of allowing that to be possible. And I think that's, I would say that's a quite amazing feature in a process like this, to give power to the citizens to actually say who they want to hear from.
Thanks, Claire. Paul Hallett on YouTube has asked if there was a list of the experts who provided information, and this is to both all three of you. I presume that was published, a list of the experts, and who chose those experts? Kathy, would you like to?
Well, there was a panel of there were the 4 experts who set up the assembly, and then there was an advisory panel, and there was an academic panel, and but what was the first bit of the question, which was what I was going to answer? Was, oh yes, it's all online. I mean, it's all online. You can see all the presentations, and I think you can actually read all the presentations. And so you can check out who, and you can see the breadth of presentations or not. But yes, it's all there. It is open in a similar way to the French.
Yes, same for the Convention. All the speakers are listed. It's in the final report as well, and all the presentations from the experts, both in plenary and small groups, have been live streamed, and they're still available on online.
Thanks, Claire. A question from Kate. Kate Dyer. She said, "I'd be interested to know more about the role of or absence of table facilitators. What effect does that have on reaching consensus, managing conflict, and the pressure to come up with recommendations?" Maybe if I can ask Claire, you mentioned about facilitation.
Yes, so as a facilitator myself, I was conscious of my own bias, and I was really surprised when I realized there were no small group facilitators. So it was, as I said, it was 2 moderators for groups of 30, and then it was self-facilitated discussions. And to start with, I was really skeptical, and I was worried. And in some instances, I've seen absolutely outstanding conversations happening where it was not actually led or facilitated, because some of the citizens took the role actually of facilitators. And one of the amazing exchange I've witnessed was a 50-year-old man, quite really confident, and a 20-year-old young woman, quite shy. And he told her, "Come on, Anna, open your chakra and tell us what you think." And she started talking about system change. And and a facilitator would have never said anything like that. And you probably wouldn't have had that conversation. But I've also witnessed situations where some of the citizens actually have left the process as a result of not being held. It was the case of a citizens, a lady in her late 70s, early 80s, really quite strong, opinionated person. And I can't remember, I think it was weekend 3, lots of tensions emerged at the table she was part of. It was not held, and then she left. And so it is a problem. It's obvious for me that needs really exploring further. So, and my hope is that we can do interviews actually with some of the citizens that have left and understand a bit more about what happened and what would have been different if the table facilitation would have been possible. So I'm still in 2 minds, but I would probably still go for small group facilitation. But a type of facilitation that I think that needs to be much more sensitive and empowering. So not have a facilitator that is in control, really much more there to witness the dynamics and much more emotionally engaged, and not just a process person in a way, I would say. And especially if we start going down the path of exploring climate change from a more emotional perspective, I think we'll need facilitators who have skills to handle that. And that's something that will be worth.
I did hear that for the online sessions in France that were actually very long periods of time, that there was domination by some people in those discussions because they weren't facilitated, and that that quite a few voices weren't heard online. I'm not sure about the UK, but I know the UK online sessions were much shorter, whereas the French sort of did the whole weekend, but online. And from what I understand, it was quite exhausting for people. Whereas the UK online was went over 3 weekends instead of 1 weekend. So each was a shorter period of time, and therefore easier for people to adapt and to contribute to. Did you notice that?
Well, I think, to be honest, we don't know actually how the French citizen felt, because we haven't, so that's one of the questions I've asked as part of our evaluation questions we've put to the citizens. And it might be that it was too much for some people, but overall, you could see that people kept going through. So I think anecdotal evidence that indeed some people were more vocal, that's true. But in terms of ability to cope and really keep engaging, I'm not sure until I see the responses and we can have quantitative data on this. I'm not sure actually. I think sometimes we underestimate what people can do, and during the face-to-face meeting, people were saying, how come these citizens can actually stay up to 11 p.m. in the evening working and starting at 9 a.m. But they did, and you can see when you've got a sense of self-efficacy or agency, actually it's energizing and people wanted more. And it's not, in the case of the Convention, people really wanted these sessions. But again, we'll have to look at the evaluation for that, I think.
That's great, thank you. There's Mafalda has asked on YouTube, how do you reach consensus taking into consideration power dynamics? It's a related question. And I think also, did people feel open to disagree? Because there was so much consensus, I think, in both examples. Do you feel there was any sense that people felt persuaded or having to agree with the consensus? Was there any liberalism?
There was a lot of debate, and actually it was what's interesting about this consensus approach is that you felt that as the Convention was moving weekend after weekend, that there was this sense of the group kind of identity forming, and almost like speaking as one voice, which for a lot of people in the deliberative democracy world, they really struggle with that, I think, because they can't see how that's a representation of French society, potentially. How can you have a really diverse group speaking as one voice? And I think still there were lots of actually tensions and debate and conversation, but at the end of the day, they felt they had to be strong, they had to be one, because they've realized that, that's my take, okay? That they've realized that there are so many lobbies and powers out there that they need to be strong to really take the measures forward. And we see it happening in front of our eyes already. Their measures being ripped apart already by the French Parliament. So, and that's why they created this small association, les 150. And again, that shows that sense that, we need to be a strong voice, because we will be facing a lot of opposition. But it's a really good point. And I think that will create probably a lot of discussion within deliberative democracy world.
Would you like to add anything? We have about 1 minute, Kathy or Alex.
I just wanted to say, in vis-a-vis engagement, I mean, I very much got a feeling from the French Convention that everybody who took part was really engaged, and they did a lot of research work and talking outside of the weekends. I haven't got that sense at all. It may be the case, but because it's been so much more low key. I haven't really got the sense of that citizen engagement and passion but maybe it's also the difference between the English and the French. But yeah.
I was going to say though, we just really don't know. They could be. It's just not been live streamed. And I was, like I say, I was there as an observer. We all left the room as soon as the discussions happened on the tables. Or for instance, even some of the Q&As were not live streamed. So we really don't know. And it could well be that most of these processes do tend to galvanize the people that take part in them, maybe not in such a collective way as has been seen in France, but I'd be really surprised if there's not people that come out of CAUK, at least some people who are going to be dedicating more time to, who've kind of been converted to the cause. It's kind of hard to go through 4 weekends of in-depth information about the climate emergency and not be like, oh, really want to do more about this now. But yeah, it's a shame. Yeah, we just don't know as much. And it'll be really exciting to see the report. I think there might be a documentary film coming out about it as well. So it'd be nice to see more.
Well, thanks ever so much. We've come to the end of the programme, I'm afraid. It's a really fascinating journey of deliberative democracy, which I hope will flourish and continue. I have to thank Reset TV for hosting this event in association with Extinction Rebellion Global's networking space. And also that if you want to find out more on the content and events, you can go to the Reset TV programming schedule at www.resettv.co.uk. Yeah, thanks very much and have a lovely weekend, and let's keep deliberating. Thanks very much.